Have you ever wondered why, despite knowing with absolute certainty that we will die, something in us still acts as if we were eternal? There's a curious contradiction at the heart of human existence. We're the only creatures fully aware of our mortality, yet we're also the only ones who create projects that extend far beyond our biological lifespan, cathedrals that take generations to complete, scientific pursuits that will bear fruit long after we're gone, works of art intended to speak to people centuries into the future. What is this strange force within us that refuses to accept the limits of our individual existence? This isn't just about denial of death or simple vanity. It's about a peculiar quality of human desire itself, the way it consistently reaches beyond what's necessary for mere survival, beyond what's reasonable given our finite time, towards something that transcends our immediate circumstances. We see this in every domain of human endeavor. The scientist who dedicates decades to a question that might only be answered after her death. The artist who sacrifices immediate rewards for the possibility of creating something lasting. Even the parent who invests in a child's future they themselves will never witness. What's particularly fascinating is how this outreaching desire doesn't diminish as we age or approach death. If anything, it often intensifies. Those who have lived most fully frequently report not a satisfaction that leads to rest, but an even greater hunger for growth, for understanding, for creation. It's as if the more deeply we engage with life, the more we touch something within ourselves that isn't subject to time's constraints, something that operates according to a different principle than our biological clocks. This pattern becomes even more intriguing when we consider our greatest fears. For many, what terrifies us about death isn't simply non-existence, but the thought of dying with our potential unfulfilled, of leaving with our true capabilities unrealized, our deepest questions unanswered, our most important work undone. Our greatest dread isn't of ending, but of ending incomplete, as if we intuitively sense that completion lies not in reaching some final state, but in continuous growth itself. Consider, too, our most fulfilling moments. When do we feel most alive, most ourselves? Rarely is it when we've reached some goal and settled into comfortable satisfaction. Rather, it's in those moments of engaged striving when we're reaching beyond our current limits, discovering new capacities, creating beyond what we previously thought possible. There's a curious paradox here. We often experience our truest sense of self precisely when we're in the process of becoming something more than we currently are. These observations point to a profound possibility. What if there is indeed something immortal within us? But it's not what religions and metaphysical systems have traditionally identified. What if it's not a soul as static essence, not consciousness as we ordinarily understand it, not personal identity with its particular memories and traits, but rather the very impulse to transcend, the drive to overcome limitations, the will to grow beyond what we are. This isn't mysticism disguised as philosophy. It's a radical reframing of how we understand the relationship between desire, growth, and eternity, one that emerged from the insights of a thinker who looked unflinchingly into the abyss of cosmic meaninglessness and found, not despair, but an unexpected affirmation. A philosopher who recognized that in a universe of perpetual becoming, where everything that exists will eventually pass away, the only thing that could possess true permanence is not any particular form or entity, but the creative force that continuously generates and surpasses every form. Have you ever felt, in moments of intense creative engagement or growth, as if you were participating in something that transcends your individual limits? As if, through the very act of reaching beyond yourself, you are connecting with a dimension of existence that isn't subject to time's ordinary constraints. There's a curious inconsistency in how we think about immortality that becomes apparent when we examine it closely. Throughout history, humans have conceived of eternity primarily in terms of preservation, the indefinite continuation of what already exists. Whether in religious conceptions of an immortal soul maintaining its identity in heaven, scientific aspirations toward radical life extension, or cultural efforts to preserve legacy through monuments and works of art. Our dominant approach to transcending death has focused on keeping something as it is. Yet when we look at the actual pattern of life, both cosmic and human, we encounter a striking anomaly. nothing that remains static endures for long. In biological evolution, species that fail to adapt become extinct. In cultural evolution, civilizations that resist change eventually collapse. In personal development, individuals who cease growing experience a kind of living death long before physical demise. The universe itself appears to follow a principle where only that which continuously transforms itself persists through time. This contradiction becomes even more pointed when we consider what we value most deeply. The greatest works of art aren't those that merely preserve existing forms, but those that transform them into something new. The most significant scientific advances don't just maintain current understanding, but revolutionize it. The most profound personal relationships aren't those that remain static, but those that support mutual growth and evolution. In every domain we truly value, it's not preservation, but transformation that characterizes what lasts. What makes this pattern particularly revealing is how it manifests in our experience of time. When we're engaged in creative activities that stretch our capabilities, when we're in what psychologists call a flow state, our ordinary sense of time often dissolves. Hours pass that feel like minutes. We lose awareness of our temporal limitations. Conversely, when we're stuck in routine, merely preserving what already exists, time can feel oppressively present, each minute dragging into the next. It's as if our subjective experience of time itself is transformed by whether we're in a mode of preservation or transcendence. Consider also our relationship with death. Those who face mortality most successfully rarely do so by clinging to what they've been, but by remaining engaged in becoming something more, continuing to learn, create, and grow until their final moments. Studies of the dying consistently show that regret comes not from failing to preserve what one had, but from failing to become what one might have been, from opportunities for growth and transcendence left untaken. This anomaly suggests a profound possibility. What if immortality isn't found in preserving any particular state of being, but in the perpetual process of becoming? What if the only thing that can truly endure in a universe of constant change is not any static entity, but the dynamic principle of self-overcoming itself? This insight emerged from the thinking of a philosopher who recognized the contradiction in our traditional approaches to eternity. He saw that in a universe governed by becoming rather than being, where everything that exists will eventually pass away, the only possible form of permanence would have to be found not in resistance to change, but in change itself. Not in preserving what is, but in continuously transcending it. What makes this perspective particularly revolutionary is how it inverts our usual understanding of desire and fulfillment. In conventional frameworks, desire is seen as lack, a temporary state of incompleteness to be overcome through satisfaction. But what if desire, particularly the desire for self-transcendence, isn't a lack to be filled, but the very expression of life's most fundamental and enduring principle? What if the perpetual reaching beyond oneself isn't a sign of incompleteness, but the manifestation of what is most complete and eternal in us? Have you noticed how those who remain engaged in growth and creation often seem to maintain a certain vitality that transcends age? How individuals who never cease in their drive to become more than they are appear to participate in something that defies time's ordinary constraints, even as their physical bodies follow the inevitable course toward death. The year is 1881. In the Swiss Alps, a solitary figure walks along the shores of Lake Silvaplana, near the village of Sils Maria. He is 37 years old, plagued by chronic health problems, and living in relative obscurity despite having published several books. His academic career has been abandoned due to illness. His personal life is marked by isolation and disappointment. By conventional measures, this is a man already in decline, with his best years behind him. This is Friedrich Nietzsche, and it's here, during his summer walks in the mountains, that he will experience what he later describes as the most profound revelation of his philosophical life. The insight that will transform his understanding of eternity, desire, and the meaning of human existence. What prepared Nietzsche for this insight was a unique combination of personal experience and intellectual background. Born in 1844 to a Lutheran pastor in rural Prussia, he grew up immersed in Christian metaphysics, with its promise of personal immortality and its sharp division between earthly desire, suspect, fallen, and heavenly perfection, static, eternal. But his subsequent education took him far from these roots. Trained as a philologist, a scholar of ancient languages and texts, he immersed himself in pre-Christian Greek thought, discovering worldviews that located divinity not in an unchanging realm beyond desire, but in the vital, transformative energies of life itself. This scholarly background converged with intensely personal experience. From his mid-20s onward, Nietzsche suffered from debilitating health problems, severe migraines, nausea, partial blindness, that forced him to abandon his promising academic position at the University of Basel. These conditions led him to a nomadic existence, moving between boarding houses in Italy, Switzerland, and southern France, seeking climates that might alleviate his symptoms. What made these circumstances particularly significant was how they placed Nietzsche in a position of perpetual becoming rather than stable being. His physical suffering meant that comfortable routine was impossible. He had to continuously adapt, experiment, overcome. His intellectual isolation meant that he couldn't rest on established ideas, but had to forge new pathways of thought. His geographical wandering meant constant exposure to different perspectives, cultures, and landscapes. In a very literal sense, his life embodied the principle of perpetual self-overcoming that would become central to his philosophy. This convergence of scholarly understanding and lived experience created the conditions for Nietzsche's breakthrough insight during that summer in the Alps. As he later wrote in Ecce Homo, the basic conception of the work, the idea of eternal recurrence, the highest formula of affirmation that can possibly be attained, belongs to August 1881. It was jotted down on a piece of paper with the inscription, 6,000 feet beyond man and time. What exactly was this revelation? Not simply that everything that happens will recur infinitely, the cosmological interpretation of eternal recurrence that has dominated many readings of Nietzsche, but something more subtle, that in a universe of perpetual becoming, where all forms eventually dissolve, the only thing that could possess true permanence is not any particular state of being, but the creative force that continuously generates and surpasses every state. Not immortality as the endless preservation of what is, but eternity as the principle of perpetual self-overcoming itself. This insight wasn't merely theoretical for Nietzsche. It emerged from his direct experience of how continuous growth and self-transcendence had provided meaning in the face of suffering that might otherwise have led to despair. Despite chronic illness, despite professional setbacks, despite personal isolation, he had discovered that as long as he remained engaged in the process of becoming more than he was, creating beyond his previous limitations, thinking beyond established categories, growing beyond his former self, his existence maintained not just meaning but a kind of joyful intensity that seemed to connect him with something beyond time's ordinary constraints. In his personal notebooks from this period, Nietzsche articulates the core of this insight. My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, love of fate. That one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. Not merely bear what is necessary, but love it. This isn't passive acceptance, but active embracing of the conditions that necessitate continuous transformation. Love not of static being, but of perpetual becoming. Have you ever found that periods of difficulty or disruption, while challenging, have also been times of unprecedented growth and transformation? Have you noticed that it's often precisely when comfortable routine becomes impossible that you discover capacities for adaptation and creativity you didn't know you possessed? Nietzsche's investigation into the eternal nature of self-overcoming began with a fundamental observation about life itself. Through careful study of both natural processes and human psychology, he recognized a pattern that contradicted conventional understandings of existence. Nothing in nature seeks merely to preserve its current state. Every living thing, from the simplest organism to the most complex consciousness, contains within itself a drive to extend beyond its present form and capabilities. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche expresses this insight through his prophet's declaration. And life itself told me this secret. Behold, it said, I am that which must always overcome itself. This wasn't poetic metaphor, but a precise description of what Nietzsche observed in all vital processes. Plants don't just maintain their current form, they grow toward the sun, extending beyond their initial boundaries. Animals don't just preserve their existing capabilities, they develop new skills, adapt to challenges, explore beyond familiar territory. Even at the cellular level, life demonstrates not static self-preservation, but dynamic self-extension. What distinguished this perspective from simple evolutionary theory was Nietzsche's recognition that this drive for self-overcoming often exceeds what's necessary for mere survival. Life doesn't just develop adaptations adequate to current conditions. It consistently generates capacities that go beyond immediate needs, creating potentials that may only prove valuable in future, unforeseeable circumstances. This excess of becoming over being, of creativity over preservation, suggested to Nietzsche that life's fundamental nature wasn't survival, but self-transcendence. This biological observation found striking parallel in human psychology. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche analyzes how our deepest fulfillment comes not from achieving static satisfaction, but from continuous growth. The most powerful desire for growth, for extension, for becoming lurks, where there appears to be the will to self-preservation. What we experience as most profoundly affirming isn't reaching some final state of completion, but the process of expanding our capabilities, understanding, and creative expression, a process that, by its nature, never reaches a definitive endpoint. Nietzsche found further evidence for this perspective in his study of cultural evolution. Examining how civilizations rise and fall, he observed that cultures remain vital only as long as they continue to transform themselves, incorporating new influences and generating new forms. The moment a civilization begins to prioritize self-preservation over self-transcendence, rigidly maintaining established traditions rather than evolving them, it begins to decline. This pattern suggested that even at the collective level, life thrives not through static continuity, but through continuous becoming. Perhaps the most compelling evidence came from Nietzsche's analysis of how we experience time in relation to creative activity. In his personal notebooks, he documented how engagement in the creation of something that transcends one's previous limitations generates a distinct temporal experience, what he sometimes called great noontide, moments where time seems simultaneously concentrated and expanded. These weren't subjective illusions, but glimpses of a different relationship with temporality that becomes accessible through the activity of self-overcoming. This altered experience of time wasn't limited to exceptional moments. Nietzsche observed that individuals who remain engaged in continuous growth, artists in the broadest sense, creating not just works but themselves, often exhibit a peculiar relationship with aging and mortality. Their awareness of death doesn't diminish with proximity to it, but often intensifies their creative engagement, as if the drive to transcend operates according to a different temporal logic than biological decline. This suggested that the principle of self-overcoming might indeed represent something that, while manifesting within time, isn't fundamentally constrained by it. In his personal correspondence, Nietzsche sometimes described this insight as his thought of thoughts, more significant even than his famous proclamation that God is dead. For while the death of God announced the end of transcendent guarantees for meaning and value, the eternal nature of self-overcoming revealed where genuine permanence might be found in a universe of perpetual flux, not in any unchanging substance or realm beyond becoming, but in the very principle of becoming itself. The evidence for this perspective continues to accumulate in our own time. Modern psychology recognizes that human well-being correlates strongly with continued growth rather than static satisfaction. Neuroscience reveals that our brains remain plastic throughout life, capable of generating new connections in response to novel challenges. Even theoretical physics suggests that at the fundamental level, reality consists not of stable objects but of dynamic processes, patterns of becoming rather than states of being. Have you noticed in your own experience that your most fulfilling moments aren't those of arrival at some final destination, but those of engaged movement toward expanding horizons? That what feels most alive in you isn't your fixed identity, but your capacity to become something more than you currently are? As Nietzsche deepened his investigation into the eternal nature of self-overcoming, he encountered a profound question. If perpetual becoming rather than static being constitutes the most enduring principle in existence, how should we understand desire itself? Traditional frameworks, both religious and philosophical, had typically viewed desire as lack, a temporary absence to be filled, a hunger to be satisfied, a state of incompleteness seeking completion. But what if this entire conception were backward? What if desire, particularly the desire for self-transcendence, isn't a sign of deficiency, but the expression of life's most fundamental and enduring aspect? In The Gay Science, Nietzsche begins to articulate this revolutionary perspective. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? Thus asks the last man, and he blinks. This passage contrasts the last man, who seeks only comfort and the absence of disturbance, with those who recognize desire not as something to be eliminated through satisfaction, but as the very essence of vitality, the force through which life continuously generates new possibilities and overcomes its previous limitations. This reframing of desire led Nietzsche to reconsider the nature of fulfillment itself. In traditional frameworks, fulfillment is conceived as reaching a state where desire ceases, whether heaven's perfect satisfaction, enlightenment's freedom from craving, or the secular ideal of contentment. But if the most fundamental and eternal aspect of existence is continuous self-overcoming, then true fulfillment wouldn't consist in the cessation of desire, but in its perpetual renewal and intensification, not in arriving at some final state, but in the endless process of transcending every state. Nietzsche's personal notebooks from this period reveal his growing conviction that what we experience as most meaningful isn't the achievement of goals, but the expansion of capacity that occurs in pursuing them. The artist's fulfillment isn't in completing a work, but in developing abilities that make possible works they couldn't previously have created. The thinker's satisfaction isn't in reaching final answers, but in formulating questions that open new intellectual horizons. The lover's joy isn't in possessing the beloved, but in continuous growth through the relationship. In each case, it's not the static end state, but the dynamic process of becoming that constitutes the experience of meaning. This insight led Nietzsche to a profound reinterpretation of eternity itself. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he presents his concept of the eternal recurrence, often misunderstood as merely a cosmological theory about time's circular nature. But Nietzsche's deeper point concerns how we relate to the perpetual becoming that constitutes existence. The question isn't whether time literally repeats, but whether we can affirm a life of continuous self-overcoming so completely that we would will its eternal return. Whether we can love not just specific moments or achievements, but the never-ending process of transcendence itself. What makes this perspective particularly revolutionary is how it transforms our understanding of mortality. If what's most fundamental and enduring in us isn't our specific identity, but our participation in the principle of self-overcoming, then death takes on a different significance. It's not the end of what's essential, but a necessary aspect of the perpetual becoming that constitutes existence. As Nietzsche writes in a note from 1885, we have to learn to think differently, in order at last, perhaps very late on, to attain even more, to feel differently. The evidence for this reframing appeared in Nietzsche's observation of how different individuals relate to the prospect of death. Those most fearful of mortality, he noted, are often those most attached to preserving their current state of being, their specific identity, accomplishments, and possessions. By contrast, those who remain engaged in continuous creation and growth frequently exhibit a different relationship with finitude, not because they deny death's reality, but because their primary identification isn't with what will die, but with the process of perpetual becoming that continues beyond any individual manifestation. This perspective finds validation in contemporary psychological research on terror management theory, which examines how humans cope with awareness of mortality. Studies consistently show that creative engagement, participation in activities that generate something transcending the individual, provides more effective protection against death anxiety than either religious beliefs about personal immortality or materialistic attempts to secure legacy through possessions and status. What these findings suggest is that humans intuitively recognize that connection with creative becoming provides a more authentic relationship with what endures than attachment to any particular state of being. Have you observed how people who remain creatively engaged until the end of life often approach death not with desperate clinging to what they've been, but with continued curiosity about what might yet be created and discovered? How those who never cease becoming more than they are seem to participate in something that transcends individual mortality, even as they fully acknowledge the body's inevitable dissolution. As Nietzsche continued his exploration, a profound pattern began to emerge, one that connected individual experience with cosmic processes, psychological insights with metaphysical possibilities. This pattern revealed something surprising. What we've traditionally identified as most essential and eternal about ourselves, our fixed identity, our particular consciousness, our specific memories and traits, may actually be the most transient and superficial aspect of our existence. Meanwhile, what we've often dismissed as merely instrumental, our drive to create beyond ourselves, our desire to transcend limitations, our will to become more than we are, may constitute our participation in what is most enduring in the universe. In The Will to Power, Nietzsche articulates this insight. And do you know what the world is to me? This world, a monster of energy without beginning, without end, a play of forces and waves of forces, at the same time one and many, a sea of forces flowing and rushing together, eternally changing, with an ebb and a flood of its forms, blessing itself as that which must return eternally, as a becoming that knows no satiety, no disgust, no weariness. This isn't poetic flourish, but precise description of what Nietzsche perceived as the fundamental nature of reality. Not stable entities, but dynamic processes. Not fixed beings, but perpetual becoming. What makes this pattern particularly significant is how it reframes the relationship between the individual and the eternal. In traditional frameworks, eternity is conceived as something entirely separate from temporal experience, whether heaven beyond earth, enlightenment beyond samsara, or some metaphysical realm beyond physical existence. But Nietzsche's insight suggests that eternity isn't elsewhere. It's an aspect of existence that we participate in precisely through our drive for self-transcendence. When we create beyond our limits, when we overcome our previous selves, we're not just engaging in temporary activities within time. We're manifesting the eternal principle of becoming that constitutes the deepest nature of reality. This perspective illuminates curious patterns in human experience that otherwise remain mysterious. Consider how certain activities, especially those involving creativity, discovery, and growth, generate what psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi later termed flow states, where our ordinary sense of time and separate selfhood temporarily dissolves. From Nietzsche's perspective, these aren't merely pleasant psychological states, but moments where we experience directly our participation in the eternal principle of becoming. The dissolution of our ordinary temporal awareness isn't an illusion, but a glimpse of a different relationship with time that becomes accessible through active self-transcendence. Similarly, this pattern explains the paradoxical relationship between achievement and fulfillment. We often notice that reaching goals provides less satisfaction than we anticipated, while the process of striving toward them frequently generates more meaning than their attainment. From Nietzsche's perspective, this isn't a quirk of psychology, but a reflection of our fundamental nature. If what's most essential in us isn't our static identity, but our capacity for perpetual becoming, then we naturally experience the greatest fulfillment not in arriving at some final state, but in the continuous process of self-overcoming itself. Perhaps most significantly, this pattern transforms our understanding of legacy and influence. What truly endures from any life isn't the preservation of specific achievements or possessions, but how that life contributed to ongoing processes of creation and growth that extend beyond individual existence. The artist's true immortality isn't in having works preserved in museums, but in how those works inspire continuing creativity in others. The thinker's enduring impact isn't in having ideas maintained unchanged, but in how those ideas generate new thought that transcends the original conceptions. In each case, it's not static preservation, but dynamic influence on continuing processes of becoming that constitutes genuine legacy. Nietzsche expresses this understanding in Thus Spoke Zarathustra through the metaphor of gift-giving. I love him who wants to create over and above himself and thus perishes. This isn't glorification of self-destruction, but recognition that genuine creation always involves the overcoming of one's previous self, a form of perishing that is simultaneously a participation in what doesn't perish, the eternal principle of becoming itself. What makes this pattern particularly revealing is its reflection in processes at every scale of existence. From the biological evolution of species through the cultural evolution of societies to the psychological development of individuals, we observe the same principle. What endures isn't what remains unchanged, but what continuously transforms itself in response to new conditions and possibilities. This consistency across different domains and scales of becoming suggested to Nietzsche that he had identified not just a local phenomenon, but a fundamental principle of reality itself. Have you noticed how your most significant influences on others often come not from what you've achieved or accumulated, but from how you've inspired continuing growth and creation? How the most meaningful connections between generations aren't based on static transmission of unchanged tradition, but on the ignition of the same drive for self-transcendence that animated those who came before. The implications of Nietzsche's insight into the eternal nature of self-overcoming extend far beyond abstract philosophy, transforming how we understand meaning, ethics, spirituality, and our relationship with mortality. If he's right that what's most enduring in existence isn't any static state of being but the dynamic principle of perpetual becoming, then many of our fundamental assumptions about life's purpose and value require radical reconsideration. First, this perspective revolutionizes our understanding of meaning. Traditional frameworks typically locate meaning either in conformity to external standards, religious commandments, social norms, or in the achievement of specific goals, success, happiness, legacy. But if the most fundamental and eternal aspect of existence is continuous self-transcendence, then authentic meaning wouldn't be found in arriving at any particular state or meeting any fixed standard, but in the quality of our participation in the ongoing process of becoming. What matters isn't where we arrive, but the integrity and intensity of our perpetual self-overcoming. This reframing resolves the paradox many experience between achievement and fulfillment. We often notice that reaching goals provides less satisfaction than expected, while the process of development itself generates deeper meaning. From Nietzsche's perspective, this isn't a quirk of psychology, but a reflection of our fundamental nature. We're most aligned with what's eternal in us, not when we've reached some final state, but when we're actively engaged in transcending our current limitations. Second, this insight transforms ethics. Conventional morality typically evaluates actions based on their conformity to fixed principles or their consequences for specific states of affairs. But if perpetual becoming rather than static being constitutes reality's most fundamental nature, then the highest ethical imperative wouldn't be conformity to unchanging rules or the production of particular outcomes, but the quality of will expressed in our actions, specifically, whether they affirm and enhance the principle of self-overcoming in ourselves and others. Nietzsche articulates this perspective in Beyond Good and Evil through his distinction between master morality and slave morality. This isn't about social dominance, as often misinterpreted, but about whether values emerge from active creation, the master approach, or reactive preservation, the slave approach. The highest ethical orientation wouldn't be obedience to existing values, but the continuous creation of new values that expand possibilities for becoming, not following rules, but giving style to one's character, as he puts it in The Gay Science. Third, this perspective radically reframes spirituality. Traditional spiritual paths typically aim at transcending desire and change to reach some final state of perfection, heaven's eternal rest, enlightenment's unchanging awareness, mystical union's perfect stillness. But if the most divine aspect of existence is perpetual self-overcoming, then authentic spirituality wouldn't involve escape from becoming into static being, but deeper participation in the creative principle that continuously generates and transcends all forms. This understanding appears in Nietzsche's concept of the Dionysian, in The Birth of Tragedy, an ecstatic affirmation not of permanent stability, but of creative destructive transformation itself. True spiritual development, in this view, isn't progress toward some final perfection, but increasing capacity to embrace and embody the eternal principle of becoming, to participate more fully in what Nietzsche calls the innocence of becoming, the ongoing creation that requires no justification beyond itself. Perhaps most profoundly, this insight transforms our relationship with mortality. If what's most essential and enduring in us isn't our specific identity, but our participation in the principle of self-overcoming, then death takes on different significance. It's not the absolute end of what matters most, but a necessary aspect of the perpetual becoming that constitutes existence's eternal dimension. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "Die at the right time, so teaches Zarathustra," suggesting that a life fully engaged in continuous self-transcendence achieves a kind of completion that isn't negated by physical death. This isn't about literal immortality or survival after death. It's about recognizing that our deepest nature already participates in something that transcends individual mortality, not by escaping time, but by manifesting the eternal principle of becoming within time itself. Our immortality isn't the endless preservation of our particular consciousness, but our contribution to the ongoing process of creation and self-overcoming that continues beyond any individual manifestation. Have you experienced moments where, engaged in creating something that transcends your previous limitations, you felt a curious shift in your relationship with time and mortality? Not a denial of death, but a sense that what's most alive in you, your capacity for continuous becoming, participates in something that isn't bound by your individual finitude. If Nietzsche's insight about the eternal nature of self-overcoming is so profound, why hasn't it transformed our understanding of existence? Why do we remain fixated on static conceptions of immortality, the preservation of personal identity beyond death, the achievement of unchanging perfection, the establishment of permanent legacy? Nietzsche identified powerful systemic forces that work to obscure this understanding, not through conscious conspiracy, but through institutional and psychological patterns that maintain our attachment to static being over dynamic becoming. Religious institutions have been perhaps the most obvious force perpetuating static conceptions of eternity. By promising personal immortality in exchange for adherence to unchanging doctrines, these institutions fulfill deep psychological needs while simultaneously reinforcing hierarchical power structures. Nietzsche analyzes this dynamic in The Antichrist, showing how Christianity in particular replaced the Greek affirmation of creative becoming with the promise of perfect, unchanging being in heaven, a metaphysical framework that both consoles the suffering and renders them dependent on institutional mediation to access the eternal. This pattern isn't limited to traditional religions. Secular institutions often reproduce similar structures, promising various forms of immortality through legacy, achievement, or social recognition, all while directing human energies toward maintaining existing systems rather than transforming them. Academic disciplines preserve established paradigms rather than fostering their continuous evolution. Corporate entities promote consumer identities that can be endlessly maintained through purchasing rather than outgrown through development. Political systems promise utopian end states rather than ongoing processes of creative transformation. What makes these patterns particularly powerful is how they align with deep psychological tendencies. Nietzsche recognized that affirming perpetual becoming over static being requires a psychological strength that many find difficult to sustain. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he explores this through the concept of the spirit of gravity, the pull toward fixed identity, established values, and secure certainties. This gravitational pull isn't just imposed externally. It emerges from our own fear of the vertigo that comes with recognizing existence as continuous self-overcoming with no final destination or perfect state. Nietzsche's personal writings reveal his awareness of how threatening his insight was to established power structures and psychological comfort zones. In a note from 1885, he writes, "I teach the no to all that makes weak, that exhausts. I teach the yes to all that strengthens, that stores up strength, that justifies the feeling of strength." He understood that his affirmation of perpetual becoming over static being would be resisted not just by institutions, but by aspects of human psychology itself, the parts that prefer the security of fixed identity to the creative instability of continuous self-transcendence. The result is what Nietzsche diagnosed as the last man mentality, a mode of existence that seeks comfort, security, and preservation over growth, creation, and transformation. This orientation isn't just a personal preference, but a systemic pattern reinforced through educational institutions that reward conformity over creativity, economic structures that prioritize consumption over production, and social norms that value stability over transformation. What makes this pattern particularly insidious is how it becomes internalized in our conception of fulfillment itself. We learn to identify fulfillment with reaching some final state: financial security, professional achievement, social recognition, rather than with the quality of our ongoing creative becoming. Even our pursuit of growth often takes the form of progress toward a predetermined destination rather than continuous expansion beyond every destination reached. This orientation towards static endpoints, rather than eternal becoming, is reinforced through contemporary media, advertising, and social messaging. Success is portrayed as achieving a stable position rather than maintaining creative momentum. Happiness is depicted as a persistent state rather than a byproduct of engaged development. Even spiritual fulfillment is marketed as arriving at inner peace rather than embracing the creative tension of perpetual self-overcoming. Have you noticed how many of our social institutions, educational systems, corporate environments, even self-improvement programs implicitly promote the achievement of static end states rather than the cultivation of continuous creative becoming? How our very language of fulfillment often emphasizes arrival, security, and completion rather than ongoing transcendence, risk, and expansion. If Nietzsche's insight about the eternal nature of self-overcoming is as liberating and aligned with existence's fundamental character as it appears, why has it been consistently misunderstood, marginalized, or actively suppressed? The answers reveal how profoundly challenging this perspective is to established frameworks of meaning, systems of authority, and our own psychological attachments. First, Nietzsche's vision fundamentally threatens traditional religious and metaphysical systems. By locating eternity not in some transcendent realm beyond becoming, but in the principle of becoming itself, Nietzsche undermines the entire foundation of otherworldly spirituality. The promise of perfect, unchanging being after death, whether heaven, nirvana, or any other form of static perfection, has been religion's most powerful consolation and control mechanism. A perspective that finds the eternal within the dynamic process of becoming rather than beyond it doesn't just modify these frameworks, but renders them obsolete. This threat explains why religious interpretations of Nietzsche have consistently distorted his thought, casting him as merely destructive, the philosopher who proclaimed God is dead without offering an alternative. But this caricature misses his actual position. As he writes in The Gay Science, God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. Nietzsche wasn't simply negating traditional spirituality, but pointing toward a more profound understanding of the eternal, one found not in static transcendence, but in the creative principle that continuously generates and surpasses all forms. Second, Nietzsche's insight threatens established power structures that derive authority from claiming special access to unchanging truth. If the eternal isn't a fixed realm of perfect forms, but the dynamic principle of perpetual becoming, then no institution can legitimately claim final authority based on unchanging doctrine. No text, tradition, or teaching can be considered the last word, since the very nature of existence is to continuously transcend every established form. Nietzsche experienced this institutional resistance firsthand. His works were largely ignored by the academic establishment during his lifetime, and when they gained attention after his death, they were often selectively interpreted to neutralize their most revolutionary aspects. His affirmation of becoming over being was typically reduced to a simple rejection of objective truth, his vision of eternal self-overcoming dismissed as mere relativism. These misinterpretations served to contain his thought within existing frameworks, rather than allowing it to transform those frameworks as he intended. Third, and perhaps most significantly, Nietzsche's perspective challenges our psychological attachment to fixed identity. If what's most essential and eternal in us isn't our specific personality, memories, or traits, but our capacity for continuous self-transcendence, then we must fundamentally reimagine our relationship with ourselves. We aren't primarily the particular someone we identify with, but the creative process that continuously generates and surpasses every identity we temporarily occupy. This recognition requires what Nietzsche calls the courage for the forbidden, the willingness to let go of our attachment to fixed selfhood and embrace the creative instability of perpetual becoming. In Ex Homo, he writes, "Formula of my happiness, a yes, a no, a straight line, a goal. But the goal here isn't some final state to be reached and maintained. It's the orientation toward continuous self-overcoming itself, the eternal process, rather than any endpoint within it." What makes this psychological challenge particularly difficult is that it confronts not just our fear of death, but our fear of life's full intensity. As Nietzsche observes in The Birth of Tragedy, we often seek fixed forms and stable identities, not just for the security they provide against mortality, but for the protection they offer against life's overwhelming creative destructive power. To affirm eternal becoming over static being requires embracing this intensity, rather than seeking shelter from it, a form of courage that many find too demanding to sustain. Nietzsche's personal journals reveal his awareness of how threatening his insight would be, not just to institutions but to individuals' psychological comfort. In a note from 1887, he writes, "Becoming must be explained without recourse to final intentions. Becoming does not aim at a final state, does not flow into being." He understood that this perspective would be resisted not because it's incomprehensible, but because it's almost too comprehensible. It reveals a truth about existence that many find more challenging to accept than comforting metaphysical fictions. Have you noticed how difficult it is to maintain awareness of yourself as a process of becoming, rather than a fixed being with stable traits and characteristics? How even in moments of significant transformation, there's a tendency to quickly solidify a new, improved identity rather than remaining in the creative fluidity of continuous self-overcoming. The final question isn't whether Nietzsche was right about the eternal nature of self-overcoming. The evidence increasingly suggests he glimpsed something fundamental about existence's character. The question is what it means to live as if this understanding were true. How would our existence transform if we recognized that what's most enduring in us isn't our fixed identity, but our capacity for perpetual self-transcendence, that we participate in eternity not by preserving who we are, but by continuously becoming more than we have been? The transformation begins with a fundamental shift in how we understand fulfillment. Instead of pursuing happiness as a persistent state or success as a final achievement, we might recognize that our deepest satisfaction comes from ongoing expansion of capacity and consciousness, from the quality of our participation in the eternal process of becoming rather than from any endpoint reached. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, "What does your conscience say? You shall become who you are." Note the continuous becoming, not the arrival at some finished state of being. This perspective doesn't mean abandoning goals or commitments. Rather, it transforms our relationship with them. We pursue particular achievements not as final destinations, but as means for developing capacities that enable further growth and creation. The value isn't in the specific outcome, but in how the process of attaining it expands our potential for continued becoming. The artist creates not just to produce finished works, but to develop abilities that make possible works they couldn't previously have conceived. The scholar studies not just to acquire knowledge, but to develop understanding that opens new questions. Each achievement becomes not a conclusion, but a platform for further transcendence. This orientation transforms our relationship with time itself. Instead of dividing life into preparatory phases leading toward some imagined peak and subsequent decline, we might recognize that the capacity for self-overcoming remains available at every stage, that each period offers unique possibilities for transcending what we've been. Youth has its forms of becoming, but so do maturity, and even the approach to death, which can involve forms of growth and creation impossible at earlier stages. As Nietzsche suggests in Human, All Too Human, the snake that cannot shed its skin perishes. So do the spirits who are prevented from changing their opinions. They cease to be spirit. Perhaps most profoundly, this perspective transforms our relationship with mortality. If what's eternal in us isn't our specific consciousness, but our participation in the principle of perpetual becoming, then what continues beyond our individual death isn't some ghostly version of our personality, but the ongoing creative process to which we've contributed. Our immortality consists not in the preservation of our particular traits and memories, but in how our creative acts influence continuing processes of becoming, how what we've brought into existence enables further creation beyond our individual lifespan. This isn't mystical consolation, but practical recognition of how influence actually operates across generations. When a scientist's discovery enables further discoveries they couldn't have anticipated, when an artist's innovations inspire creative expressions they couldn't have imagined, when a parent's nurturing allows development they couldn't have foreseen, in each case, something of the original creative impulse continues, not as static preservation, but as dynamic influence on ongoing processes of becoming. If this perspective resonates with your experience, you may already be participating in this form of eternity more fully than you recognize. Those moments when you push beyond your previous limitations, when you create something that exceeds what you thought possible, when you discover capacities you didn't know you possessed. These aren't just temporary achievements, but instances of connecting with what Nietzsche calls the eternal joy of becoming. Not a joy that persists unchangingly, but one that continuously renews itself through the very process of self-transcendence. This isn't a path for everyone. As Nietzsche acknowledges in Beyond Good and Evil, the noble soul has reverence for itself, meaning that this orientation toward eternal becoming rather than static being requires a particular psychological strength, a capacity to value creative growth over comfortable security. But for those who recognize themselves in this vision, it offers not just a philosophical perspective, but a practical approach to living that aligns with existence's most fundamental and enduring character. If you found value in this exploration, I invite you to experiment with shifting your orientation, from identifying with what you are to embracing what you're becoming, from seeking to preserve your achievements to using them as platforms for further creation, from fearing the dissolution of your fixed identity to recognizing that your participation in the eternal process of becoming already transcends that identity's limitations. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and this secret spoke life herself unto me. Behold, said she, I am that which must ever surpass itself. Have you begun to recognize yourself not just as a being who sometimes changes, but as the very process of becoming that constitutes existence's eternal dimension?